Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. I am so delighted to introduce my guest today. We have on former member of Congress and current dean of the Robertson School of Government at Regent University, Michele Bachmann. Now, by way of background, in 2000, Michele Bachmann defeated a longtime moderate incumbent for a state Senate seat in Minnesota. And in 2006, she entered the race to represent her suburban Minneapolis congressional district. She won 52% of the vote, becoming the first Republican woman from Minnesota elected to the House of Representatives. She easily won re-election in 2008 and 2010, went on to be a presidential candidate in 2012, and one of my personal heroes who gave so many Americans a voice. Michele, welcome to This Is Your Country.
Paige, thank you so much. I've been looking forward to our interview today. It's going to be a lot of fun.
That's right. So I want to get right into it. So what issues in the political environment in the 2000s inspired your leap from local to national politics? What were the issues troubling Americans at the time that were going unaddressed in Washington and led to the rise of the Tea Party movement?
Well, what led to the rise of the Tea Party movement was actually Obamacare. I went into Congress, I ran in 2006, and the reason why I ran, quite frankly, is I was serving in the Minnesota State Senate. Our local congressman decided to run for the U.S. Senate. That created an opening for Congress, and I was urged to take that seat, to run for it. And Minnesota is not a conservative state. But if there is a conservative area, it was a somewhat conservative area. So there's very keen interest from people in running for it. And I saw from my time in the Minnesota State Senate how the profound impact that a legislature can have on people's lives, for good or for evil, in the state legislature. And I'd worked very, very hard in the state legislature. And I thought at the federal level, I was especially concerned about the debt load. My background is that I was a federal tax litigation attorney. So I had worked with civil and criminal tax cases. And so I grew up understanding the value of a dollar, and I was just appalled because Minnesota is a big spending state. I was appalled at how much money government spent and how much government wasted. I also had other interests, though, too. My husband and I had started our own business. We had a Christian counseling business, and we have 2 locations. We have psychiatrists, psychologists. So I saw the impact that government was having on healthcare in terms of the regulatory burden and trying to micromanage patient care, which I thought was a bad thing. Also, my husband and I had been foster parents, and we had brought 23 children into our home that we had fostered. And really, the reason why I got involved in politics was really through the foster children. We had 5 biological children in our home, and our census was 4 foster children at any given time. So our total census was about 9 kids in our home. Our biological children were either homeschooled or in private Christian school, but that wasn't even an option for foster children in Minnesota. They had one answer, and that was public schools. So we had the foster children in the local public school. And when one of our 11th grade daughters brought home for her math homework coloring posters, I was appalled, because if anyone needs a leg up, it's a foster child. And it's really insulting and demeaning to have a foster child in 11th grade coloring posters for math homework. And all I can tell you is at that moment, something happened in my mind. And it was really a godly calling. God put a calling in my heart to try and figure out what happened to America's public schools. My husband and I had gone to public schools. They were fine, but I knew something was really wrong. And the bottom line is, Paige, that led to 2,000 hours of research on my part. And I took my legal skills and I researched federal curriculum, federal contracts, state contracts, local contracts. I interviewed teachers. I tried to unravel what happened. And it really consumed about 5 years of my life in total. That's what got me into state politics, trying to fix America's education system. And that was also on my mind when I went to Congress as well. So I'm kind of a full service conservative. I'm interested in every topic, every issue. But the background that I really focused on was trying to return academic excellence to our schools. But then also, I was very concerned about taxes and spending, and what I really saw as an unraveling in America and a tax on our freedom.
Absolutely. And what a important blessing and advantage it was that you had the education background and the capacity and the interest to devote, as you say, these thousands of hours to researching these public policy problems, because there's so many regular Americans who are so consumed with, raising their families, having their businesses, just as you were, and they don't have a voice. They don't have the opportunity to be doing that. And so it's amazing to me that you were just a regular person who was pushed to this threshold where you said, whatever is happening with the education system in my state, in my area, is intolerable, and I need to sort of switch my focus and dedicate some time to this, because there are so many regular Americans who they feel voiceless, they feel they cannot do that, and they are witnessing their public services be distorted for these purposes or failed. They fail in their purposes and no one holds them accountable. And so it feels hopeless very quickly. So it's amazing to me that you were able to pivot your attention to something like that and then become not just a voice for your constituents and for, as you say, the foster children that you were helping raise, but a national figure who gave a voice to these issues for so many people as part of that critical movement at the time. And so another question I have is, what was it like running for office as a candidate from this type of outsider perspective without the advantages of a sort of like corporate-backed, establishment, hand-picked favorite?
Well, I genuinely was an outsider because I wasn't a political person. We were involved in business, and I was involved in my law career. And then after our fourth baby was born, I stayed home full time. That's when we started bringing foster children into our home. So we had a really full plate in our family. And, but I was a big reader. My entire life I've read and tried to consume information and know what's going on. And it was really just a calling, I think, again, from God, to read a lot and to know what's going on. And I think when I ran as an outsider, I had started this journey of trying to understand the problems in education in Minnesota in 1998. So it was 2000 when I ran for the Minnesota State Senate, totally an outsider. We're what's called a caucus state, where you show up for a caucus and people in that room decide who the candidate is going to be. And in my case, we had the longest sitting Republican state senator in Minnesota in my district. Only he was the reliable Democrat vote. He was like the Mitt Romney. He was like the Mitt Romney of our state. And people were fed up with him. And I had shown up for that event in a ripped up sweatshirt and tennis shoes and jeans. And so I showed up for that thing, and people were standing around saying, we come here and we crown this guy king every 4 years, and he votes against us with everything. We should just challenge this guy just to let him know we're sick of him. And so they were pointing fingers, and I had been speaking a lot in Minnesota on academic excellence, and people pointed at me and they said, well, why don't you challenge him? And I looked around and my heart sunk, and I thought, if I ever did have any political plans, this would shoot him down right now, because I look like a freak. I didn't even take a shower or comb my hair that morning. And I thought, when you run for office, it's a real thing. People get campaign committees and they raise money and the whole thing. And I'm just like, no one from nowhere. But at that moment, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. And at that moment, it was like the Holy Spirit just spoke into my mind and said to me, are you willing to be a fool for me? And I thought about it, and I thought, yes, Lord, I'm willing to be a fool for you. So I said yes, that I would do that. No idea. And I went to the front of the room, and there are like 300 people in this room. And I said, well, I don't know what I do. I'm going to put my name in. And they looked at me, and I said, well, what do I do? And they said, well, you have to stand up on stage and give a speech. So I gave a speech on freedom for academics, for education, freedom when it comes to taxes, and freedom when it comes to the issue of pro-life. So I gave a speech. I sat down. The senator stood up. He gave a speech. He sat down. And then they said, would someone from the Bachmann committee come back to the counting room because they were going to put all the ballots out. There was no Bachmann committee. And so I just turned to the woman sitting next to me. She was kind of a formidable sized woman. And I figured nobody'd mess with her. And I said, would you mind going back and being my representative in the counting? So she went back, and you had to get 60% of the vote, which is a lot of the vote, in order to be the endorsed nominee. So she went back, and it took like over an hour for them to count. She came back, and she'd written on her hand what the vote totals were. And she showed me, and I said, I don't even know what that means. And she said, you got over 60% of the vote on the first ballot. You're the endorsed candidate for Senate. And I thought, what have I done? My husband was up north with our little girls at a wedding, and, I hadn't asked him. And so you don't just give an endorsement back. This was literally something that I wasn't planning at all. And so ultimately that turned into me actually having to run, knowing nothing, having no money, no committee, no nothing. And God just pulled it all together. He brought people to help me run this campaign. I had to raise $50,000. It seemed like the moon and the stars, because we're not wealthy people. But God just worked it all out. And the entire force of the machine in Minnesota came against me. But I just stuck with it. And I was like, the turtle that just kept going and persevered. So I knocked on doors, did what I had to do. And ultimately, obviously, I won the primary election. I went on to win the general election. That was a huge fight with the Democrats. And then I stayed in the Minnesota Senate and served for 6 years. And then when it came for Congress, I knew how hard it was to fight in an election. And so at this time I asked my husband before I decided to run for Congress, and he was on board with it too. And so I had a group of people around me, but it really was also, it's a caucus state, very labor intensive. You have to go sit in people's living rooms and make your case. And I just worked extremely hard. And I was glad I did. And I think a lot of times that the prize goes to the person who wants it the most, who works the hardest. And so I worked really hard. I won that election, and then I won every subsequent election once I went to Congress. And then I just decided after 8 years, the Lord had called me in to run for Congress. And I sensed the Lord was calling me out after 8 years. I actually didn't want to leave because I was serving on the Intelligence Committee, which I loved. We dealt with the classified secrets of the nation. And I loved that service. I rearranged my whole life so I could focus 40 hours a week just on that committee. That's kind of an unheard of thing to do. But it was so important because there were so many Islamic attacks in the United States at that time. It's kind of during the Obama era. In that period of time, we had all these attacks. And so I felt like I was doing something really valuable on that committee. But nonetheless, I left, and I wanted to be obedient to what I thought God was calling me to do, so I left. And then I've been doing a number of things since then, speaking really around the world, around the United States. I serve as the co-chair of the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. We go all over the world and try to explain to people the importance of supporting Israel. But then also now I serve as dean at the Robertson School of Government. It's a graduate school preparing the next generation to go and serve, whether it's in government or teaching principles about government, because that's one thing that's unbelievable. People really have no clue what the American government is supposed to be, or what our Constitution says, or how our government works, or what our rights are. People have no idea. There's a total misunderstanding on the First Amendment today. So that's part of what I'm trying to do, is pour into this next generation so that they will learn how to stand up for our freedoms today, but on into the future, because things are changing dramatically in this nation.
That's absolutely right. And I'm so glad that you shared that origin story of how you got into politics in the first place, because this confirms a thesis I've been developing for a while, which is that when the when the political establishment and the mainstream media identify a candidate who has this spontaneous, authentic, grassroots appeal, who is able to connect with an audience, whether it's in a living room or in these caucus situations, and they see this candidate speak from the heart, connect with the public, they know how high the stakes are, because they know that authenticity, it's not contained to that specific area, a certain defined set of issues. They know that type of grassroots appeal is contagious, and that it grows and snowballs into a bigger threat. So I feel that when you came on the scene with tenacity and clarity of vision and this ability to connect with voters, that sets off alarm bells in the certain type of operative, journalist, whatever it may be, that has an incentive to protect the status quo and keep outsiders an arm's length distance away. And so to me, that starts to explain some of the media hostility that you experienced, especially as you rose to prominence nationally. And so you rose as this figure who was galvanizing the GOP base and who was articulating policy positions very effectively. And as you became more effective, the more intense the oppositional media coverage became. And so obviously, this is a playbook that they run against GOP candidates who are most effective at representing people and viewpoints that they do not want to have representation. I think that's another key aspect of the emphasis you place on education, which is that if people are ignorant of the rights and basically the responsibilities that a government has to its people, that ignorance is a form of disenfranchisement, and it enables the government to take advantage of people. It enables bad actors who work in concert with the government, whether it's the hostile press or whomever, to take advantage of the public. And so what were some of the most significant examples of the media working against you or deliberately mischaracterizing your stances to delegitimize you, delegitimize our voters, diminish your standing with the public?
Well, it's sins of omission and sins of commission. And I saw the very first time I ran on a national level, really also in the state level as well, but really on a national level, I saw that the media had zero interest in letting the public know that I had a doctorate degree, but also a postdoctorate degree in federal tax law. So I had worked extremely hard to go through and gain that credentialing and then apply that in my work as a federal tax lawyer. No one even knew that I was a lawyer, let alone a federal tax lawyer, and what I had done with that, or the fact that we had started our own company from scratch, or the fact that as a child, my parents, upon their divorce, they went from middle class to below poverty overnight. And I grew up below poverty and then worked my way through college and worked my way through graduate school. Nothing was handed to me. And so all of that, I don't say that in a poor me way. I say that in terms of that was my life situation, and God used that for my good, to help me through that time, to teach me the value of a dollar and teach me work skills and all the rest. So I'm extremely grateful for that background. I'm very grateful for the parents that I had and the life situation because of what it helped me to become. But what I saw from the media is that if good points about a candidate that they don't like, they refuse to tell that story. They refuse to tell the positive about what this person can bring into the public square. But on the other side, they also can falsely make claims about an individual. So I had a lot of false claims made about me. In particular, when I was a very high-profile national figure in the United States Congress, the work that I was working on was the problem that we had of Islamic influence in the national government. Especially, in particular, it happened before President Obama came in, but the door was really flung open during his term. And I had written a letter together with 5 other congressmen, and I recruited 4 others to join me on this letter to ask the inspectors general of 5 different departments to look into instances in various federal bureaucracies of this influence of Islamic influence in these departments, specifically toward terrorism, with a view toward advancing terrorism. I wasn't identifying Islam in order to discriminate against people who hold that religious viewpoint. People can hold that religious viewpoint. That's protected under law. That isn't what my concern was. My concern was those who were coming into government with terrorist plans in mind. And so I asked questions, and I became the focal point of a national smear campaign. So I know what that is like when you have CNN, MSNBC, the major magazines. I saw it all come out, and I was smeared as a hater of Muslims, a hater of Islam. In fact, it was just the opposite. What I was trying to do was to bring safety into the United States and identify those people who were using their faith for terrorist purposes. And it's hard to remember because we forget so quickly, but we had at one point a terrorist attack about once a week in the United States, yes. Whether people were gunned down, whether, there are all sorts of instances. In Texas, you've had a number of attacks in Texas as well. So it was an area where I was the victim of a national smear campaign, and that smear campaign was intended to bring me down in the eyes of the public in my home state so that I would be defeated politically. I wasn't defeated politically, but if the media comes after you hard enough, I think this is fairly clear, especially if you're a member of the House of Representatives, as I was, it's almost impossible to come against literally tens of millions of dollars in negative targeted advertising. It's extremely hard. When you have one voice and you can't get your own voice and your own viewpoint in the media, this was even prior to a lot of alternative media. So it can be extremely difficult. But again, I think people need to go into office knowing who they are, what they stand for, and why they're going there. Because if you go there with a thought in mind that your whole goal is to stay there for years and someday hold a gavel and chair a committee, you're going to become the system. That's exactly what happens. You resemble the system. You're never going to reform it. All you're going to do is augment the system that is in desperate need of change and reform.
That's right.
And so that's why I went, and that's why I think I became a huge target.
That's right. And there becomes this way that so many politicians, even if they are able to effectively channel or mimic the rhetoric that gets voters excited and gets them on board, as you say, they become entrenched in protecting a system that is not helping the public, that can even be hostile to the public, because they need to protect their position, they need to protect their capacity to fundraise. And as you say, they don't have a vision for helping our country that they can stay true to in their heart. They don't have this guidance that helps them make ethical, proper decisions to protect the country. And so I think that, as you say, it's especially interesting the media treatment you get when you are trying to solve a problem on the public's behalf. You are looking at, as you say, weekly Islamic terrorist attacks in the country, whether it's, like a person driving a truck into a crowd, a person bringing a gun into a religious establishment, whatever it is. And you are trying to say, gosh, it would be really nice if people weren't, threatened by this, terrorist activity in their everyday lives in places that should be safe. And if we could save lives from this type of activity. And the media looks at that and says, this is an illegitimate cause and we need to smear the person who is trying to protect the public from this. You are dealing with a profoundly distorted moral, political, social environment where it is so difficult to give normal Americans a voice. And so I have to say, my heart goes out to you for dealing with that hostility for so many years. It takes so much tenacity. Having worked in the White House, I saw how President Trump, they tried to wear him down with that type of tactic. They try to delegitimize every stance you take when you try to give the American public a voice and you try to stand up for them. So speaking of how this can also even come into conflict with your own party, I am dying for the scoop. What was it like interfacing with John Boehner and members of the establishment wing when you were trying to give the GOP base more of a voice while the establishment worked to tune it out?
Well, the establishment is about empowering and maintaining its own power. That's really all it is. And the one thing that you see fairly quickly is that it isn't just Democrat, Republican, it is the ruling class. And they're there to advance big government and to augment and enhance big government. And anything that comes, it isn't that they're focused on the Democrat agenda, they're focused on their own people. Because within the Republican Party, anyone who opposed what it was that the Speaker of the House wanted to do, they were public enemy, and the Speaker would come after them. I think that was, people saw that example very clearly in the midterm election when Mitch McConnell refused to give money to General John Bolduc in New Hampshire, and instead he decided to give money to fund Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, and who she said she was going to support Democrat candidates, and then immediately after the election, you had Mitch McConnell trying to advance Democrat causes and issues like maintaining the cartel that the mainstream media has. I mean, it's absolutely appalling and unthinkable what you see from these Republican leaders. And this is what I don't understand. Here you have abject failure. So, whether you believe the election was rigged in 2020 and 2022 or not, the fact is Republicans lost. They lost big in 20, they lost big in 22. So in what universe is failure rewarded with another go at leadership? Mitch McConnell was the Senate leader when I came in Congress in 2006. The cat is still there. They're giving him the leadership wand once again. I don't understand in this universe why this happens, and they're not advancing the Republican Party platform. That's what the base is voting for. They're not advancing it. Why in the world would we give them votes? Would we volunteer? Would we send our donations to them? I mean, this is really appalling, and it's at an extremely serious juncture. In the House of Representatives, the same was true with John Boehner when he was the leadership, and then it went to Paul Ryan. I mean, it was really shocking after this midterm election. You hadn't heard boo from Paul Ryan, who didn't lift a finger during the 2018 election. He lost the House of Representatives. So he was trashing Donald Trump after this midterm election. And he was framing and painting Donald Trump as the reason why Republicans lost the midterms. I mean, this is like such a fantasy view of reality on the part of Paul Ryan, who didn't give any interview. This is the first interview Paul Ryan gave in 4 years after he was MIA. He was missing in action during the 2018 election, wasn't out there raising money, wasn't out there campaigning for any of the candidates. The House loses in 2018. So President Trump didn't have a majority to work with. Remember, Paul Ryan wouldn't allow Obamacare to be voted on after President Trump won between 2016 and 2018. He wouldn't allow that to come forward. He wouldn't allow the funding for building the wall to come forward. It was Paul Ryan who was the obstacle for advancing the Republican base concerns after President Trump won. And then he lost the House for President Trump in 2018. So here he's lecturing and saying it's President Trump who's the big problem in 2022. I guarantee you, no one was thinking about Donald Trump when they entered the voting booth in 2022, the first week in November. It didn't happen. They were thinking about Joe Biden, who had a 28% approval rating, who through the folly of all of his policy measures caused us to have a terrible life. In my lifetime, we've never seen a greater drop in the American standard of living.
That's right.
Than in these 21 months of the Biden presidency. That's what the American people were reacting to. Every bit of the polling data pointed toward a change election. It's my opinion we did have a change election that would have changed us decades into the future. I think the results that came out of this midterm did not reflect how the voters cast their votes in the ballot box.
I totally agree with you. And it's so frustrating to watch these deceitful interviews that people like Paul Ryan give and all these other folks who they blame President Trump totally baselessly when people when President Trump and figures like you, going back to, the prior midterm cycles and things, galvanized huge millions of voters to bring the party back from life support, to try and get some activity, to give the public representation against when it became clear under the Obama presidency and then under the Biden presidency how clear or how hostile the government was becoming to the American people. And whenever you have candidates who are successful at galvanizing that public sentiment, capitalizing on it, the establishment is working to sort of like release the pressure to neutralize the movement a little bit, to defang it, and make sure sort of lower voters' expectations, whatever they do to lessen the impact that these highly energized voters want to have and can have and get mobilized to have. It's really, really sick. It really, they behave as controlled opposition. And the sad thing is our country is suffering. As you point out, we had this egregious economic sentiment as Joe Biden is squeezing the American public with energy policy, wanting to increase taxes on people, these giant redistributive bills, fake COVID aid, redistribution to other countries, enormous invasion at the southern border. Across every single issue, it's the government hostility to the people. And yet the Republican Party could not really muster any way to mobilize the public properly. You get the sense that they don't want to win, that maybe they are they're owned by some type of interest that wants them to keep, obeying or facilitating the Biden agenda in a way. It's a travesty because...
Well, you're right. It is controlled opposition. That's what I saw. Because the enemy should have been the political enemy, which was Obama during the Obama years and now Biden during these years, because this isn't just a difference of opinion. This is a completely different ideology. We're looking at a bait and switch right now, a jujitsu, if you will. The American ideology, which is framed in our founding documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Northwest Ordinance, all of our founding documents, that ideology, which allowed the greatest, most prosperous, freest nation on earth in 5,000 years of recorded history, there's never been a nation like the United States of America that could rise so quickly. It happened because of these incredible principles based on freedom that Americans enjoyed. And that's why people wanted to flow into the United States to be able to enjoy and live in that kind of environment. That's not what we're getting. Joe Biden and the people, it's not Joe Biden, everybody knows that. Whoever is behind Joe Biden, who's making the decisions for how we live, they're swapping out, they're canceling what America is all about, not through our votes, not through our choice,
right,
but through their choice. So they're putting in place a totalitarian regime that resembles the communist Chinese surveillance state. That's what we're getting right now. We resemble China more than we resemble ourselves even 40 years ago.
That's right.
So once you lose it, you don't get it back. And I think that's why I truly believe we had one of the greatest change elections occur this last November. I think it was overwhelming, the votes that went to reject the Biden agenda.
Yes.
We didn't see it because of all of the tricks that were employed. And it isn't just one trick, it's like 57 different tricks that they employed. And so now just think of that. We've had 2 elections where the Democratic voice of the American people has been bamboozled. 2 elections, one focused on the presidency, one focused on the control of the United States Congress. So here we sit in a post-Democrat era because, first of all, the Democrat Party despises democracy.
Yes.
They hate the will of the people.
That's right.
They hate it. They're so selfish. They want their will. And their will reflects a totalitarian regime. And what do I mean by that? That's where all of the control doesn't come from what the vote of the people. It comes from what they want on top. And it's a very different world. It's an ugly world. It's a world that we don't want to inhabit. And the people voted strongly, I believe, against it. And so it is demoralizing. And when you see our Republican leaders, McConnell, McCarthy, Ronna McDaniel. I think I was probably more appalled at their lack of reaction to the election. I was traveling for about 2.5 weeks during the election, speaking in a different state every day. And I think the day after the election, I think I had to fly to California. And I was in the Los Angeles area giving a speech then that following night. And I had the front page of the Los Angeles paper blaming Trump for the outline. And it was clear what the leftist, progressive left narrative was. They wanted to use this to blame and slam Trump. And instead, it was crickets from McConnell, from McCarthy, from Ronna McDaniel. They didn't say anything. They should have been screaming about these election results, filing lawsuits, demanding that we're not going to accept this. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So at this point, we're a party without leaders.
That's right.
We're a party without leaders. And so in the House of Representatives, they need to get their act together and get a decent leader to represent what our party platform represents and stands for. But the same is true in the Senate. And the same is true at the RNC. Because what are we? If we're just going to go along with being controlled opposition, who are we controlled by? We're controlled by the progressive left.
That's exactly right. And you see this in the policies that they work together with Biden and the Democrats on. And so you've got Joe Biden and all of his, advisors, his ambassador to the UN, made that horrible video last year where she said the founding documents of our country weaved white supremacy into our founding. They say these unbelievably denigrating things about the country that they are in charge of representing and stewarding to success. Yet these are the people that Mitch McConnell and other senators are saying we need to find some bipartisan common ground to work with and to get some of their priorities passed. And so when they are doing that, they are saying we want to cooperate on the most fringe, repellent, extremist, George Soros endorsed positions so that we can claim that we did a bunch of, virtuous bipartisan activity, whether it's their infrastructure graft, whether it's amnesty for illegal immigrants who came to our country and broke our laws. At every turn, it's a new betrayal with a new policy idea to cooperate with people who want to run our country into the ground. And so the frustration that we have is with this total inability to secure representation for normal Americans who want their country back. And as you say, we have no leadership at the top of the party doing this properly. And I wonder.
That's why, Paige, if I could jump in, what we need to do is take 3 steps back and not continue doing what we've been doing. We got to take 3 giant steps back or go up to a 50,000 foot level and realize this election cost $16.7 billion. And that's just what's being recorded. $16.7 billion. The worst outlay is the outlay of our time. We put so much time into this to try to have a change election. If you're ever going to have a change election, it was this election cycle.
Yes.
Nobody should believe that this status quo outcome, in other words, no change. Joe Biden wasn't supposed to come out the day after election, but he did come out because of the, quote, victory that they had. And he came out and said quite clearly, well, I guess what this shows is the American people love my policies.
They want more of it.
I'm not changing it. Yeah, yep. I'm not changing my policies. That is such a load of garbage. So we have to step back and realize we've been had. We've been had at the ballot box, not just once, but 2 election cycles in a row. And this is what my message would be for the head of the Senate, the head of the House, and the head of the RNC. And it's this. They should say, look, since we've been had for 2 election cycles, we're not going to be a part of this same kind of voting next time around. We will participate in a transparent system of voting, and that's what we're going to do. And if Democrats want to join us, let them. But we're not going to let Democrats run the elections anymore. In my home state of Minnesota, the Democrats run all the elections. Well, how do we ever think we're going to get a fair result? We don't.
Exactly.
We can't. We get these unbelievable election results that are statistically impossible. And so really, honestly, what the Republicans need to do is say, this is obviously fraud.
Yeah.
And we're going to stand up for the voters.
Yep.
And so they didn't do that the first time. They put apples in their mouths, and they didn't say anything in 2020. Remember, Facebook would throw you off, Twitter would throw you off. People were losing jobs if they even questioned the outcome of the result in 2020. Well, by 2022, it was weird. It was almost like somebody was spraying a zombie fog of delusion across the country, because the weekend before, you had all the Democrat anchors looking like their dog. Oh, we know we're going to lose. We didn't listen to the people. This is going to be a terrible outcome.
Yes.
And so then on election day, when absolutely all the data said it was going to be a slam dunk for Republicans, when over 81% of the American people said America is going in the wrong direction, when 27% when independent suburban women had jumped by 27 points away from Democrats toward Republicans, the Black vote had doubled, the Hispanic vote had grown by leaps toward Republicans. I mean, on every measure, this was going to be an absolute change election in the midterms. So for the Republican leadership to put duct tape over their mouths, say nothing, run again for leadership, I mean, how dumb are we? At this point, we don't participate in fraud.
That's
why
right.
Why would we be an accessory to voting fraud, or even give it any form of credibility when it's a completely uncredible system? That's what we need to do. Stand up and say what it is, and just say, we're not going to play the game. We're done. We're coming up with a voting system that works, and that's the one we're going to participate in. In other words, just draw a line in the sand.
Right. And that type of thinking is smeared as radical, fringe, etc., when the fact is it is responsive to reality, which is that the opposition party has developed ways to commandeer election procedure, commandeer voting procedure in a way that is deliberately designed to narrow the universe of outcomes that voters are allowed to select. And through this type of manipulation and through this type of abuse of the institution of elections, it's becoming a completely intolerable, in some cases illegal, situation. And so I appreciate that you are willing to put this in stark terms, which is that to continue behaving as though this is a normal way to run elections, as though Americans will ever be able to have their voices heard when institutions are subverted to this extent, it's delusional or it's deceptive.
Well, and because I think the thing that we need to understand, this isn't a game. This isn't a game. This is deadly serious, because there are people who have designs on turning the United States into something that reflects communist China. And we need to understand that. We don't get to live this life anymore. On this new system that's being put in place in the United States, we don't get to live our life. The same week as the phony midterm election results, the really big events were happening globally.
Yes.
Like COP27, the climate change summit that met at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. That's where the big event was happening. Because remember, President Trump pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord treaty, and instead, Joe Biden put us back in. And so what was voted on there? Reparations. Yeah. So as if it isn't enough to have redistribution of wealth in the U.S., now we have to do redistribution of wealth across the world. And then at the same time, it was the B20 and the G20 that met, where they just announced, all the countries of the world got together, and in 2023, we're going to give up our national sovereignty over healthcare decisions to the World Health Organization, which is run by the Communist Chinese Party. And so everyone now will have on their phones a digital passport. So you have to make sure you get tested when government says you have to get tested, and for pandemics, and you have to get all of the shots that we say that you have to get. That's this year. In 2023, they're saying that. And then at the same time, they started their 3-month trial on digital currency. So in 2023, we could see the American economy collapsed. We could see digital currency and also on our phones, the digital passports for a pandemic, because we know Bill Gates, why does he get to control this world? Bill Gates, just in the last few weeks, they wound up another tabletop exercise in Brussels in the EU to have another practice pandemic where they were practicing for an even deadlier pandemic based in an RSV virus specifically directed toward children. So these people have done evil things to us for the last 3 years. Why we would put up with this anymore? We have to have people stand up. I'm not calling for violence in the streets. I'm calling for being intelligent. Being intelligent, use your brain, exercise our freedom. We don't have time. I mean, people need to understand this is a really urgent issue, this loss of freedom for the American people. And we have to demand that when January comes, the Senate should never be led by Mitch McConnell.
Right.
The House should only be led by someone who wants to stand up and have a voice and advance our constitutional republic. And the RNC shouldn't be led by the same individual who brought failure in the last 2 cycles. We've got to have people who are urgent, who are conversant with our founding documents and want to stand up and articulate freedom, because I'm telling you, we don't have the luxury of too many more election cycles. We don't have the luxury, because we need to realize these global conglomerates like the G20 and the B20 and the UN climate change garbage and the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperative, they're all in a different place.
Yes.
They love global entities.
Yes.
And they are assuming we're in it. So don't think that we're going to be free once we give up sovereignty to the World Health Organization. It's over, because then you've got a corrupt kleptocrat like Tedros making the decision about the United States and our healthcare.
That's exactly right. And I remember being so shocked and demoralized across the whole year of 2020 when you had the COVID tyranny, and then layered on top of that you had the George Floyd Summer of Love, where Republicans were agreeing with Democrats about our nation being founded in the sin of racism, about the conspiracy theory of systemic racism, vilifying law enforcement. They were lining up in lockstep. And then obviously layered on top of that, the manipulated election procedures that made it impossible for Americans to really have a voice. And so it was shocking to me, the complacency that we witnessed from those leaders you describe. I could not believe how uninterested they were in saying, this is a really serious and dangerous direction for our country to be in, and it's becoming impossible for the public to achieve recourse against all of this, these experiments being forced upon the public. And so,
well, exactly. I mean, just you mentioned 2020. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Right.
This was the most expensive insurance event in the history of the United States post George Floyd. And if the truth be told, if you look at the autopsy reports, the official documentation after George Floyd died that day, the autopsy is very clear. It wasn't the police officer whose knee was on actually the shoulder of George Floyd that killed him. The proximate cause of his death wasn't that intervening action. The proximate cause for his death was his predisposition toward heart issues, but also the fact that he was loaded with methamphetamine, fentanyl. He had COVID at the time. He had all sorts of things in his body, and the medical professionals said that he was 15 minutes away from death. And he was recorded walking around the streets of Minneapolis before the police even arrived, saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." So everyone is sad that he died, but it appears that it was at his own hand, that because of his drug use and his misuse of his body, that was the proximate cause of his death, then, not the police officer.
And then you had our GOP leaders silent as whole cities across the country were offered up as like blood sacrifice to the cause of criminal justice reform or
blood sacrifice
racism.
is the perfect terminology. I just was speaking in Washington, D.C. Black Lives Matters Square is right in front of the White House. It's right in front of the Hay Adams Hotel and St. John's Church, the historic church. And these people tried to burn down that historic church. That was the epicenter. And it really did unleash like a spiritual, demonic presence of lawlessness across the United States. We're still living with that level of violence and lawlessness in the United States. And these cities that are controlled by Democrats, and they refuse to quell it.
Yes, and they would not send in the National Guard. They let these fires rage. They let this looting rage. They let innocent people who had spent decades building up their businesses. I remember seeing one couple from, I think it was either Minnesota or Wisconsin, who their entire furniture store that they had spent decades building burned to the ground, destroyed. They're sobbing. And the fact that our leaders had no sympathy for the people who were being offered up as sacrifices to, I guess, avenge the cause. To me, that was the most serious breakdown in the peace and law and order, that the basic obations that a government has to its citizens. That was a really serious issue.
It was, because politicians, they're petrified that they'll be called a racist. So whatever the new demand is, every 10 minutes for some new demand, politicians just bow down because they fear being called a racist. That's particularly true for Republican leadership. They want to make sure that they aren't called racist. And so what happens, we allow unequal treatment under the law. We allow the undermining of constitutional rights because politicians fear being called racist. We aren't standing for racism. I'm not, you're not, this organization that you're with is not standing for racism. But what we are standing for is one nation under law with equal treatment under the law, where if you commit a criminal act, you should be held accountable for that criminal act.
Right.
And if you had your property or your body violated, you deserve justice for having that happen.
And this breakdown of, as I say, that the government's chief obligation is protecting the safety of its citizens. And when you cannot walk on the street, you cannot have a guarantee that your business won't be burnt to a crisp because of an unfortunate incident in, someone in police custody. We don't live in the society that we contracted into. We don't live in the society that we were promised, that we pay taxes for. It is being intentionally distorted and repurposed into something that none of us asked for and none of us voted for, where living a peaceful existence is not possible, and where the most antisocial criminal element is rewarded for their behavior, and innocent people who are doing everything the right way are punished. And you cannot have a society that way. Michele, I want to ask you one more thing, which is, from your time in Washington, when you were fighting for all of these causes, dealing with issues ranging from immigration to the intelligence bureaucracy to Benghazi, Islamic terrorism, you name it, what were some of the most shocking things you heard said, or most shocking betrayals you witnessed from the people who were supposed to be solving problems on behalf of our country?
Well, I was there during Benghazi. I sat on the Intelligence Committee during that time. And I was in the room. I was one of less than 5 people who were in the room when General Petraeus came in, and together with other people who were in the intelligence community. And they were telling us about the phony, made-up Hillary story, that there was a spontaneous riot that happened, and that's why Benghazi happened. And it quickly unraveled what a lie that was. And then Hillary Clinton, who had presidential ambitions, she refused to go on the Sunday morning shows and answer questions because she didn't want to be caught in what she knew was an obvious lie. So Susan Rice was put in front of all the TV shows. She went on 5 shows, I think, and then gave the phony story. So we watched all that on the Intelligence Committee, where we were lied to by the government in real time as this happened. And you saw that. I think the thing that was even more shocking, and that was after I had just left Congress, was to see that the Obama administration used the FBI and the CIA, the DOJ, to attack which meant also taxpayer resources, the power of government, but the money of government to attack and disable and to defeat Donald Trump when he ran for president in 2016. There has never been any reconciliation of this. This had never happened before to anyone's knowledge, but our government was used to defeat a political opponent to benefit Hillary Clinton. And even with all that, Hillary Clinton still couldn't win. I mean, what does that tell you about what kind of a candidate she was? But I mean, this is unbelievable what our government has done. And I believe in this last midterm election cycle, we saw something, Paige, just as bad, if not worse. When you look at the fact that our taxes went into the United States Treasury, which is the world's biggest ATM machine for politicians, our taxes then went as a gift from Joe Biden in the form of almost $60 billion to Ukraine. That money, nobody knows where that money was spent. There's never been any auditing or accounting. And instead, Ukraine, the most corrupt, the poorest country in all of Europe, in the middle of a war after all the devastation, they apparently have billions of dollars sitting around that they can go ahead and invest with this 30-year-old Sam Bankman-Fried. They can invest in his cryptocurrency, and then that money ends up in the coffers of the Democrat Party, and then also in the Republican Party, truth be told. One of the executives gave money to Kevin McCarthy for the midterm election. I mean, this is corrupt and dirty as it is, because these politicians are lazy. They're lazy, they're selfish, they don't want to raise the money. So now where are they raising the money? They're just stealing it through money laundering operations out of our treasury to run their own corrupt elections.
That's right.
And we're putting up with this. And we're putting up with this.
And when you see this Sam Bankman-Fried character, he was like the biggest Democratic donor short of George Soros, and now his fate is in the hands of all these these law enforcement
Democrats that he gave money to.
The law enforcement officers of the Biden administration.
I used to sit on financial services committee. So he's going on to financial services, and here you have Maxine Waters writing little love mash notes to Sam Bankman-Fried. Would you please come in front of the committee? And so the Bahama law enforcement went ahead and nabbed him, and they're going to extradite him for this committee. You know that this thing is going to be a complete cover-up whitewash in terms of an investigation. How do you know that? Because the good old Southern District of New York took on the investigation.
That's right.
Where all Democrats go to be protected, and where all real investigations go to die. People need to understand what happened with the U.S. Treasury dollars being laundered through Ukraine, coming back and going to fund this midterm election. I'm telling you, this is more of the corruption that's happening. And this was 200 times worse than what Bernie Madoff did to rip off the people that he ripped off. 200 times worse. And so is anything going to happen to this Sam Bankman-Fried and his phony girlfriend? I mean, it's unbelievable what happened with these people. And then now it's coming out, the new CFO of FTX is coming out saying he's never seen anything like it. That was a complete phony operation. A couple of people, they had no controls in place whatsoever. Right. It was literally a shell corporation used to scam money through. And so here they sit, billions of dollars gone. Nobody knows where it is, except it was used to advance the Democrat Party election victory in 2022. And we are patsies and fools if we don't stand up and demand a truthful legal result out of all this. And that's why I think I don't envy the Republican leadership at all. They have a very heavy lift, but we got to get some really tough guys in leadership in the Republican Party to hire the people that need to be hired to do the forensic studies of what happened in the last two elections, what happened in this campaign finance fraud that happened through FTX. And it's got to happen fast. This can't go on forever. It's got to happen fast, because the next election of 2024 will be upon us. And is it too late now? It might be, but if we want any sort of justice in 2024, we got to have the smartest people that there are. And I don't think the current leadership fills that profile.
Right. And it's so important that you bring up that so much of this stuff is funded by taxpayer dollars being repurposed inappropriately. And it extends so far. You had so much, the trillions in COVID aid being dispersed without any oversight, without any audits. It's this. It really is a form of disenfranchising the public when there's no accountability for how this money is spent. And then it's another way to deprive the public of a voice and of justice when they find ways to manipulate law enforcement. So the truth of these matters is obfuscated. The public never really knows. And then the people involved are protected. And it's
and the media plays the role of either broadcasting flimsy little things that the Republicans have done, but hiding over what the Democrats have done. The worst fraud from COVID money happened here in Minnesota. And it was a group of Somalis that had stolen probably about $500 million, but it's documented at least $250 million. And they did it in a phony food program where they claimed they were distributing food to children. I mean, statistically impossible. Prior to that, we had another fraud in Minnesota from Somali women. Almost every Somali woman claimed to have a daycare in her home. And so the FBI in 1 year identified $100 million in cash transiting through the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport in little rollerboard bags back to Somalia. So that doesn't even include all the money they spent in Minnesota. So, I mean, Minnesota has been a location to be ripped off for fraud for decades. And now it's happening at the federal level. And when bad guys are allowed to get away with defrauding the public purse, trust me, it doesn't stop. It only gets bigger. And on these election cycles, what the progressive left loves to do, I really believe that they prefer to steal an election by fraud than by winning it outright. I think it gives them a rush when they can figure out how to manipulate the result and get that result. But what are we, chumps, to sit around and take it? That's why people have got to find their voice, but really find your brain. Find your brain, find your backbone, do something about it, because we aren't going to be allowed to live in a free society much longer. That's coming to an end. Totalitarians love to control our lives. And so we aren't going to be able to live in freedom much longer, certainly not our children.
The lack of honesty, the lack of clarity, the lack of willingness to stand up for the rights of American citizens to not have their money laundered and stolen. And as these problems just get worse and these problems get ignored. And we've got, as you say, people need to find their brains. They need to find their voice. Michele, I want to thank you for coming on This Is Your Country. I want to thank you for your service to the American public. I really hope that we can find a way to mobilize Americans who know that what is happening in our nation is not right. And I look to your example as someone who's able to look at these policies and say, this is not okay. We need to fix it.
Paige, thank you. And it goes without saying that not every Somali is a fraudster. It's just that we have terrible examples here, so that, your point is well taken. But thank you again for allowing me to be on.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your time. And again, thank you for your service to the country.
Thank you.